The next major topic that Hume considers is causation, or basically the idea that there's some kind of causal power in things in the world. For instance, that fire has the power to produce heat, has the power to produce smoke, has the power to burn things, and so on. The idea that there's a regularity to events, and the events of a certain type and the effects that those events cause, and that what occurs with a given event or in relation to a given object is due to some power that that event or those objects have to produce those results. Hume describes these ideas briefly as follows. He says, there are no ideas which occur in metaphysics more obscure and uncertain than those of power, force, energy, or necessary connection, like the necessary connection between a cause and an effect is what he has in mind, of which it is every moment necessary for us to treat in all our disquisitions. Now, we aren't reading the same literature that Hume was reading at the time, where people were arguing about these things, but the notion of a cause and an effect is pretty common to us, and the notion of something having a power to do something or bring things about is pretty common to us. So I think we can focus on that part of what Hume's saying, and we can get something from his account here. He starts to build towards a answer to the question of what this power is, what such things are, by reminding us of his principle that he's going to apply to all metaphysical questions. He says, it seems a proposition which will not admit of much dispute that all our ideas are nothing but copies of our impressions, or in other words, that it's impossible for us to think of anything which we have not antecedently felt, either by our external or internal senses. To be fully acquainted, therefore, with the idea of power or necessary connection, let us examine its impression, and in order to find the impression with greater certainty, let us search for it in all the sources from which it may possibly be derived. So, spoiler, Hume is going to now look for this impression that corresponds to the idea of power. He's going to look for it in all the different areas of human knowledge or experience where it might be found. And he's going to conclude that it can't be found anywhere. And because of that, because there is no actual impression that corresponds to the idea of power, he's going to conclude that powers don't really exist. Now, I have to qualify that a little bit. He does think that there is a sentiment or a feeling that we have, which is where we get the idea of power. But it's so different from what the idea of power that we normally have is, that it justifies thinking of power as something that's not really anything other than our own inclination to think and act a certain way, which we're going to learn more about in just a moment. Can this impression of power be found out in the world? If we study fire closely, do we see in fire itself an impression of its power to produce heat or produce smoke? For the same reasons that Hume before has said that someone who came into the world without any prior experience wouldn't know that fire was always hot. It would take a while for them to learn that fire is hot. And any other kind of association between their experiences and their ideas. Because of this, it doesn't make sense to say that we can find an impression of power out there in the world among objects interacting with each other. Likewise, we can't really find it in our own will. We look inside ourselves and we don't see power itself. We don't see an impression or we don't have an experience of the connection between our will to do something and whatever it is that we do. We will to do something and we do it, but we don't see the connection between them. We don't see a necessary connection between the one thing and the other thing. Likewise, in the manipulation of our own thoughts. And Hume also considers this kind of peculiar example, which is a doctrine known as occasionalism at the time. There were a number of philosophers who argued that they actually thought very similarly to Hume, in the sense that they thought there's no real explanation as to why fire should be hot, or why it should create smoke, or any other connection between events or experiences in the world. There's nothing logical about those connections. They have to be discovered. They're discovered by experience. But the explanation for why those things always go together as they do, like why fire is always hot, is that there is a God who always makes them go together, or brings about the effect from the cause in a regular way. This also allows this God to sometimes make exceptions and conduct miracles, because this God could suddenly make it that this particular fire didn't burn someone, and then that would be a miraculous case where they survived, a terrible fire, and they weren't burned at all. So it's the power of God to associate any effect with any cause, according to the occasionalists, and God is bringing this about all the time. God is the thing, God is the necessary connection between the cause and the effect. There's no necessary connection inherently in the things. That connection is made to exist by this divine force, God. Now, Hume thinks this is a kind of a ridiculous position, because how could you ever confirm these elaborate things that you're claiming God is doing? I mean, what experience would convince you that God is behind the connection between causes and effects? It's hard enough to find out what basis within experience there is for thinking of connections between cause and effects. Trying to come up with a basis in experience for believing that God is the connection point between causes and effects, that's going to be really hard, really unlikely to occur. So Hume kind of dismisses this as not a position that needs to be taken that seriously. But Hume does offer his own answer, as I indicated before, and he identifies the impression that leads to our idea of powers in things as being it's an internal experience that we have. And it's a bit surprising what he says. So I'll read this paragraph where he explains it. Upon the whole, there appears not throughout all nature any one instance of connection which is conceivable by us. That is his conclusion from having considered those different possible sources. All events seem entirely loose and separate. One event follows another, but we never can observe any tie between them. They seem conjoined, but never connected. And as we can have no idea of anything which never appeared to our outward sense or inward sentiment, the necessary conclusion seems to be that we have no idea of connection or power at all, and that these words are absolutely without any meaning when employed either in philosophical reasonings or common life. But, Hume continues, there still remains one method of avoiding this conclusion, and one source which we have not yet examined. When one particular species of event has always, in all instances, been conjoined with another, we make no longer any scruple of foretelling one upon the appearance of the other, and of employing the reasoning which can alone assure us of any matter of fact or existence. We then call the one cause, the other effect. We suppose there is some connection between them, some power in the one, by which it infallibly produces the other, and operates with the greatest certainty and strongest necessity. It appears then that this idea of a necessary connection among events arises from a number of similar instances which occur of the constant conjunction of these events, nor can that idea ever be suggested by any one of these instances, surveyed in all possible lights and positions. But there is nothing in a number of instances, different from every single instance, which is supposed to be exactly similar, except only that after a repetition of similar instances, the mind is carried by habit upon the appearance of one event to expect its usual attendant and to believe that it will exist. This connection, therefore, which we feel in the mind, this customary transition of the imagination from one object to its usual attendant, is the sentiment or impression from which we form the idea of power or necessary connection. Nothing farther is in the case. So the source, the impression from which our idea of power or necessary connection derives, is just our feeling of being carried from the idea of one event to the idea of the other. And that being carried in our minds is something that happens because of habit, because of our having seen one thing constantly conjoined with another thing. And at this point, Hume actually defines a cause both as an object followed by another, where all the objects similar to the first are followed by objects similar to the second, or as if the first object had not been, the second would not have existed. And then, thirdly, defines a cause as an object followed by another and whose appearance always conveys the thought to that other. So what he's doing here is he's defining a cause simultaneously as something that is a connection between events and is a connection between our ideas about events. And he's saying really those are the same thing. All a cause is our inclination to think that that an event of a certain type is usually followed by events of another type. And that's something that we form by habit, not by reasoning. So question here is this a good account of what a cause is or what a power is? Can you think of any alternative account of what a cause or a power is that would be more convincing to you or more satisfactory to you? And what, if anything, justifies a belief in causes or powers? If Hume's analysis is right, we have a good reason to, I should put it this way, we might not be able to avoid thinking that there are causes and powers. But whether our beliefs in causes and powers are justified is almost it's either a meaningless question or it's a question where the answer is not really, but nonetheless it's still unavoidable or there's no good alternative to reasoning on the basis of a belief in causes and powers. But the foundation for the belief in causes and powers themselves has actually been shown to be very thin, if not non-existent. They really depend on something in our nature rather than something that we can rationally justify.